Hey everyone, welcome to the Tell Me It Will Be Okay podcast. This is the podcast focused on raising anxious kids in a worried world. And boy, are we living in a worried world right now. For this episode, I wanted to talk about the juxtaposition of anxiety and depression and talk a little bit about why those go hand in hand and what we are meant to do about it. This is of special interest to me because I was definitely an anxious child and an anxious teen, but how it came to the attention of my parents and my teachers and how I experienced it most was as depression. And it wasn't until my late teens when I finally got access to a therapist who was able to see all of me and all of my situation, that she said to me, I don't think you're just depressed. I think you are also anxious, and we need to talk about your anxiety. My anxiety has always been social anxiety. That was the kind of anxiety that I struggled with as a child. Also some separation anxiety. Separation anxiety and social anxiety tend to work together. Kids who have separation anxiety and don't really grow out of it are more likely to develop social anxiety. And that social anxiety continues even to this day. I continue to live with it and learn to cope with it. It doesn't restrict my life. Like, I don't think that I would actually meet criteria for social anxiety now. Meeting criteria means that you are having some dysfunction related to the diagnosis. I do not experience dysfunction on a regular basis about it, but I still feel it. I still have the experience. And that's why I would still say I have social anxiety, even though I probably would not meet clinical criteria. If I took an assessment, I would probably screen out of the assessment. Anyway, as I said, my anxiety was more present as depression. So let's talk about that. If you have a child who has depression, if you yourself struggle with depression, I think it is important to look and see if there is anxiety present, because my experience is they are two sides of the same coin. So way back when I was getting my training in postpartum mood disorders, we were really only talking about postpartum depression. Really, when we were talking about postpartum, we were talking about PPD, postpartum depression, the baby blues. That was the discussion we were having. But when I was getting my training, I noticed, and my colleagues noticed, and the people I was getting my training with were noticing, that postpartum anxiety was actually much more common. My clients were coming to me less because of their depression, although they were identifying themselves as having postpartum depression. But what seemed most pressing in their day-to-day functioning was the anxiety about caring for their child, their anxiety about their parenting and being a good enough parent, their anxiety about whether or not their child was developing well and appropriately. And this seemed much more pressing in session than the depression. And the depression seemed to come out of this anxiety. And we would talk about this in our trainings. And we all agreed we need to be talking more about postpartum anxiety. And in fact, we are talking about that more. We are seeing that as part of the case conceptualization more. And I'd like to see that happen too when we're talking about anxiety in kids. As I said, where there is anxiety, there often is depression. Not always. My experience has been with my own struggles with anxiety and depression, and as a clinician observing and as a parent of a child who has struggled with anxiety, is that the depression tends to come later. So we'll have an anxious young child, and as they grow, if their anxiety is not addressed, they are more likely to be depressed. But also sometimes when their anxiety is addressed, when they are working on those coping skills, the depression can still come along anyway. So why is that? Why do these things seem to come hand in hand? Well, there are a lot of reasons. One of them is there is a theory, and I've seen this referenced in several different books, including one of my infant toddler mental health textbooks, which I would pull out here, but I'm not going to run and go get it. But the theory is that Our brain is always trying to be in stasis, which means it's trying not to be too depressed or too anxious. And if one of those gets a little higher, the brain will bring the other one up to try to get that into stasis. I think when I look back, I can see that in my experience, that as I got more anxious, my depression would rise in this effort to try to get me to be level. The higher my anxiety went, the higher my depression went, because they are sort of opposites. So that is one theory. I offer that to you so you can see if that seems to jive with your experience or observation. And then the other thing is both anxiety and depression come with a kind of negative emotionality. I have talked in previous podcasts that children with anxiety, people with anxiety, tend to see things through a more negative lens. They tend to be looking for danger. They tend to be looking for bad news. This is part of the prep that comes with anxiety. If I anticipate bad things happening, I can prepare for it. Remember, anxiety craves certainty. Anxiety is scanning for danger. Anxiety is always preparing for disaster. If we are scanning for danger, the world looks yuckier. The world looks less safe, which can lead to depression. That negative emotionality that fuels anxiety, of course, would fuel depression. If you are constantly seeing the world through a muddy lens, then of course it's going to be less encouraging out there. Now, when I was a kid, my dad told me, you need to quit being so pessimistic. And I thought of myself very much as a pessimistic person. It was only later that I realized I'm not actually naturally pessimistic. I am kind of optimistic, but I have a pessimistic lens that sort of covers up my optimism. So I always tell people I'm not pessimistic. I'm an optimist who worries. I do want to believe in good things. I do believe in people and humans and humanity in spite of some of the things I observe. But I am very sensitive to the bad things that happen or that might happen. And in fact, in some ways, my optimism makes me a little more anxious because when I get optimistic, I start to worry that my optimism is unwarranted and sort of answer it with pessimism. So for me, this negative lens is more complex than just straight everything is terrible. However, when I was a teen, I did indeed think everything was terrible. And the more I was pushed to be optimistic or to defend my pessimism, the more entrenched I became. I offer this because often when our kids are discouraged or negative or grouchy or gloomy, we try to offer them an alternative view, which ironically keeps them more stuck. So instead of a, hey, turn that frown upside down kind of view, I encourage parents to just be more accepting that this is how their child sees it, and then offer a more neutral view. So instead of turn that frown upside down, why don't you be happier about it? We can say things like, I appreciate you're worried about that. Let's just go and see what happens. Let's just try it on for size. And that is much more neutral and makes them feel less defensive. And also for those kids who do tend to be demand avoidant, it gives them some room to be flexible in their thinking. If you're not asking me to be happy, I don't have to answer with being sad. If instead you're saying to me, I invite you to have whatever experience you might have, that gives me room to consider having a different kind of experience. All right, so we've talked about the idea that our brain is trying to even out. We've talked about the negative emotionality. And the other part of anxiety and depression is that anxiety limits us. I talk a lot about this. Anxiety asks us to be small, to not take risks, to not grow, to not try new things. And that is a difficult way to be. For one thing, you're disappointing people all the time. People want you to try new things and you're saying no. People are rolling their eyes. Why can't you at least give it a go? People are sometimes arguing with us, arguing with each other. You're too hard on that kid. You're too easy on that kid. Why do you have to make everything difficult to the child? I remember this too as a kid. My brother and sister used to call me a spoil funner because I was always dragging the family backwards. We would go to amusement parks. I always had to wait while other people went on the ride because I was afraid of the ride, or I needed more time to come to the conclusion I am willing to try the ride, and there wasn't time for that kind of caretaking. Again, I was demand avoidant. I was a slow to warm kid. I needed time to come to my decisions, and when you've got other kids, there isn't always time, and that made me feel bad about myself. I was aware that I was ruining things for the family, that I was difficult, that people were always having to wait around for me. That made me feel lousy. It made me think about myself as somebody who was difficult, that people didn't want to be around, that people would not be patient with me, that I was the problem. When I am working with parents of anxious kids, I need them to notice this too, because I think this is where we can really get in and do some work with kids, is this idea that they are difficult and impossible and even unlovable. And instead, we need to let them know, you come to things at your own time. You are allowed to come to things at your own timetable. When I am working with families with anxious kids, I'm asking those parents to say, can you give your child a different idea of themselves? Instead of someone who is constantly failing, who is holding people back, as someone who needs to take their time, as someone who is a little more slow moving, and that's fine, as someone who needs time and space to consider things. I think it's really helpful to reframe kids as, hey, you're slow to warm. You come to things on your own terms. That's fine. In our culture, we tend to reward the go-getter kids, the kids who leap into action, but it is okay to be the kind of person who needs to survey the lay of the land. You can point out to your child when that approach really benefits, when it's good to pour the puzzle out on the table and consider all of the pieces before you dive in. We can build that time into our functioning. If you know your child takes longer to come to things, we can arrive to things a little bit early. Instead of saying we're going to try to ride 12 roller coasters at the fair, we can say we're going to try to ride 4. We can change the expectations and functionings for the family. We can point out to our child that even though they took longer, they are able to go towards things. At the same time, we can also share with them that more negative emotionality. I have an exercise for kids in my CBT family toolbox, which is about talking about rose-colored glasses and how some of us have other lenses, maybe blue-colored glasses, that make things look a little more gloomy, and that's just the way we see things. It's not necessarily a representation of reality. We can say, I see things through a more blue lens or a cloudier lens. You see things through a rosier lens. We both see things differently, and the truth is much more neutral. There is a neutral lens that we can borrow. So instead of saying don't see things that way, we can say, what if you saw things this way? What would look different to you? How might you behave if you tried on a different lens? We can actually create lenses to try on. Get an old pair of glasses or go and get some reading glasses from the drugstore and color them so that we can play with seeing things differently. A new perspective. Again, neutral, not rosy sunshine all the time. And finally, we can talk about when we feel agitated and scared, it makes sense that sometimes then we feel discouraged and beaten down. When we name these things, we are bringing them out into the open. We are taking kids away from the shame of struggle. I will always be someone who is a little more melancholy. In some ways, I like being that person. I like being able to cry at movies, be moved by music. I like that sometimes on a rainy day, I like to cuddle up and just let myself be gloomy. But I don't want it to rule my functioning. And that is something to learn over time. If your child has a more negative emotionality and is more vulnerable to anxiety and depression, we cannot fix that for them. We can only help them cope with the reality of having that kind of personality. Now, Having said that, sometimes medication does indeed make sense for kids and adults who struggle with anxiety and depression. That is a discussion to have with your prescriber. That is a discussion to have with your child. That is a discussion to have with a therapist, because if your child is on medication, it is very important that you get clinical eyes on them. Kids who are taking antidepressants are more vulnerable to having suicidal thoughts, and that needs to be part of the clinical picture and the clinical plan. But that doesn't mean to completely rule it out. It also doesn't mean that your child will be cured. Medication can be a help, especially for kids who are so anxious or so depressed, they are unable to access the tools that we're trying to teach them. But they are not a cure-all. Kids still need help. They still need skills. They still need support. Regardless of what decisions you make about medication, it is very important that the whole family system get care and attention and education to help living with the reality of living with anxiety and often depression. That is today's episode. If you have any thoughts or feedback, I would love to hear it. If you have questions, I encourage you to go to my site, openbookparenting.com, and share them with me there. You can post them anonymously if you'd like me to address them on the show, or post them to me and I will respond to you via email. I look forward to talking to you next time, and thanks for tuning into the show.